I'm talking with Richard Beck, who is chairman and professor of psychology at Abilene Christian University and a frequent blogger, as well as written several books that have gotten lots of attention. And Richard, let's start out talking about clean and unclean.
Okay.
You started researching that lots of years ago, right?
Yeah, many years ago. I went to a conference and I went to a session done by Paul Rosen on discuss psychology. And I told my wife afterwards that was the most interesting conversation I'd ever heard, and I have no idea what to do with it. Fascinating research where they would elicit just odd responses, discuss responses from undergraduate participants, things I still do in my classes. And I eventually connected all of that research with just incidents in the Gospels, the way people reacted to the unclean tax collectors and sinners in the gospel accounts, and started just seeing parallels in the way our churches treat people you consider outsiders or marginalized populations or unclean for various moral reasons. And so started trying to explore those connections between contemporary Christian behavior with the gospel accounts, with the psychology I was exploring.
Okay, so as I understand some of your research, if I reach out my hand to shake your hand, you're perfectly willing.
Yeah, I'm willing to do that.
Okay, and we just exchanged lots of germs, right?
I think so.
Okay, so give me some examples.
I don't know who exchanged more germs or not, but
haven't I heard you say I would be less in danger of getting germs by licking a toilet seat than I would be by shaking hands with you?
I don't know if I've said that, but that's an interesting parallel.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which is to say, our reactions to that are not rational.
Yeah, like one of the things I talk about is the way attributions of contamination and contagion and are often governed by what psychologists call magical thinking. Then in the realm of food, where our feelings of revulsion or avoidance make sense, if an insect is found in your food or in a restaurant that you frequent, that makes sense that you want to back away from that, from a contamination from a food. But what happens is when those attributions get applied to human beings, then avoidance of human beings, when there is no real moral contamination, moral contamination doesn't pass through physical touch, and yet we act as if it does. And so we pull away from people, if not physically, at least emotionally. And so that's a form of magical thinking where it's not a rational reason response. And even you'd even admit it to yourself that physical contact with something the moral contagion doesn't rub off on us. And yet from the very early developmental stages, kids play contamination games on the playground where people pass around cooties or something like that. And so we reason about morality as if it is actually a germ. And that creates an emotional response that we realize isn't rational, but yet it affects our behavior.
Okay, and I take it that part of the issue here is I can't just tell you to stop that.
Right. I think that's exactly the point, is that those emotive, affective, and by affective, I mean affectional responses are instantaneous, and they're very quick and they're very rapid. And you're already behaving well before a rational response begins to be elicited.
Okay, so I would assume, going back to how you're reading this with some biblical texts and Christian stuff, I assume that's not who we want to be.
No, I think it's exactly right. Okay. Well, for an example, one of the illustrations I give with students, and I apologize for this being a somewhat disgusting response, is that whenever I'll bring students on stage in the freshman seminar class that we do together, and I'll bring out something that I tell them is dog feces, but it's not. It's a Tootsie Roll, but they don't know that. And I bring an apple out, and I touch them together, and I ask if they would eat the apple after they feel like it's contaminated. And they go, oh, of course not, I wouldn't do that. And then I say, well, if the contaminant contaminated the pure substance, it works the other way, right? Like the apple would have made the dog feces delicious. And they're like, no, it doesn't work that way. And that's called in psychology negativity dominance, where the negative dominates over the positive, the pollutant contaminates the pure. And that makes perfect sense in the realm of food. But when you see Jesus eating with the unclean, that's the attribution that the Pharisees make. They see the contact between Jesus and the sinners, and they just make the rational, negatively dominant attribution and say he's the one that's been contaminated. And so the Pharisees quarantine themselves and they back away. And I think that's what churches do. They end up standing on the outside where they see kind of a very missionally minded, hospitable Jesus going into those places. And yet we're just not wired to see what he's doing as a natural kind of thing. It doesn't make sense to us. Our emotions are triggered in the opposite direction, and we find ourselves being kind of exclusive, cliquish, gated communities, not crossing those contamination boundaries the way Jesus did.
Okay, so we've talked about this before, but let's talk about it now. Okay, so we have lots of church leaders, preachers who'll be looking at this. Can I preach my way out of that?
I'm skeptical if you could preach your way out of that. I think you can hear a sermon about the Good Samaritan, 100 times, and that's going to affect us rationally and cognitively. And yet we see failures of the church all the time. And so there's something going wrong. It's not a educational issue anymore. I think we can all pass a quiz on what the Good Samaritan's supposed to do.
Sure.
So something is going haywire. And my response as a psychologist is to say the thing that's missing here as far as a spiritual formation practice is that it's those affectional things that we're talking about, the emotional triggers that are well in play before we pause and go, oh, I probably should have, stepped into the discomfort. I probably should have stopped on my way to where I was going. And so yeah, I think education, and by that I mean sermons or Sunday school classes, can only penetrate so far until the affectional, emotional parts of our being are rewired. It's going to be hard for us to behave in a very quick and spontaneous and freely loving way to the needs that we see in the world.
How does that happen? How do you reach that deeper level?
Well, I think you're going to have to go against the flow. You're going to have to be very intentional in moving against the grain of your affections and your emotions. You're going to have to kind of retrain yourself. And that can't be done through just more study. That is going to have to be putting yourself in a very intentional way to approach people that you might have some emotional difficulty approaching. You might need to go against the discomfort and the unease. And I think that's the part that's missing. Our people are not making those intentional choices to swim upstream against their affections so that those affections can't be rewired or reworked or reformed or reshaped in that encounter.
So you're basically talking about practicing your way into better affections.
Right, exactly.
I'm thinking, I hadn't thought about this in a long time. When I was at a church in New York, there was a woman there who had a great fear of blind people. Mm-hmm. And it seemed like it kind of crossed over the line of being sort of irrational. But she does have the concern that a lot of us have is, I don't know how to help them. I don't know how to lead them. I'm afraid I'm going to bump them into something. And we happen to have a couple of blind members of our church. And she just sort of made up her mind, okay, I've got to get over this. They're part of this community. And she did that. She just very intentionally started placing herself in positions that were uncomfortable. And lo and behold, this great friendship formed. And it wasn't, she may have had to force herself into it at the beginning, but she certainly didn't at a certain point where it became a genuine friendship. It was actually sort of amazing to watch because she thought, okay, that's what Jesus would have me do. Tell me about how this worked for you.
Well,
tell us a little about your own kind of spiritual journey.
Well, and to jump off what you just said, I bet if you approached her and said, how has that reshaped your feelings toward not just that particular person who's experienced blind, but other blind people, and you'll probably discover that they lean in now where they would have leaned away. They're now leaning in to anytime they see somebody with a visual disability, suddenly their affectional horizons massively open up. My journey began, I was writing a lot about hospitality and welcoming, and it was all fairly abstract until I stumbled across this little Catholic saint called Thérèse of Lisieux and something that she called her little way. And she lived in this convent and found herself wanting to kind of live a radical life of Jesus, and she didn't know how to do that in the kind of cloistered community she was in. And I think a lot of people who want to live hospitable lives struggle with how to do that. They find themselves at home or at work, and they're like, my life seems really kind of small. Where's that radical hospitality come from? And what Teresa Lisieux described in what her little way was, she just kind of noticed the people in the convent, that the sisters that weren't a lot of fun to hang around with for social skills reasons or a variety of other issues. And she just made this very intentional practice of approaching, very much like the story you told, very intentional practice of sitting with, giving a kind word, smiling at somebody. And so that's kind of what I did. I started a very similar story at Highland. I went around and said, there's probably a person in here that'd probably be the last person I would approach, for a variety of reasons. We all have very different triggers. When I talk to churches, I talk a lot about all the different emotional triggers. And some of them are handicap and disability. Some of them are wheelchairs or blindness. But for some of us, it's socioeconomic signals. Somebody looks lower income. It might be hygiene that is the trigger. So it's a very sensory trigger. I know people at Freedom who have lots of smell triggers. It can be difficult when you're working with certain marginalized populations. Other people don't mind that at all. For some of us, it's politics. You find out about the political stance of somebody, lots of emotions get in play. And so in my own life, I started kind of approaching people in my faith community and in the Abilene community in a very intentional way. But I had to make that decision. This person is probably, I don't lean in here. And I need to go against the grain and be very intentional, putting myself, exactly the same story you told about that lady you mentioned.
How did you do that?
Well, for me, it started with going out to the prison. I started, I thought that was a community that I probably felt a little uncomfortable about and didn't know a lot about. I was concerned about it from a justice perspective, but there's still lots of fears about incarcerated populations. So I started doing that and just went to the person, Bob Gomez, at our church, and I knew Bob was doing a Bible study, and I approached him and said, how do I be a part of that? And then my wife said something funny to me a couple months after that. I felt real good about myself. I'm welcoming the prisoner as Jesus said to welcome the prisoners. And she said, you're really patting yourself on the back for welcoming a population that can't follow you home at night. And I realized that they were kind of locked up and they couldn't really interfere with the boundaries of my life. And so I started going to Freedom Fellowship. And at Freedom Fellowship, we reach out to a very marginalized community, people with lots of different needs, from cognitive disabilities and mental illness to homelessness to drug addiction to criminality, and started just kind of putting myself in that community over and over to build those kinds of surprising friendships. And then at Highland, I started approaching people that, again, I probably would not have normally approached. So one example of that is Christy. Christy is blind and in a wheelchair, and exact same story. It made sure every Sunday I introduced myself to her over and over. And eventually we became friends, and now Christy sits with us. And then she wanted to know where we went to Bible class, so Christy comes to the Sojourner class. And surprising friendships have grown up there. And I began visiting Christy where she lives at an assisted living facility, and now I have relationships there. And so I was visiting her just this week and to take her shopping. And it was the evening medication time, and there was just a line of the people there at the facility, and I was just waiting for them all to go through get their meds, and they all knew me and I knew them, and we just sat there and had this conversation. I find myself in a very, a couple years ago, I would have never been befriending these people at this assisted living facility, but it all began by me just intentionally saying hello to a person in a wheelchair at my church.
What's that done to you? I talk about where faith was before you sort of started taking that initiative, and where it is now.
Well, I think my faith had almost completely dried up before I started doing this. Christianity had become, for me, a real intellectual exercise. I was good at faith because I had read more books than a lot of people. It was all knowledge-based. But that isn't very sustainable. After a while, there's not a lot of vibrant back to that. So I struggled a lot with doubts and questions, and I cared about from a moral perspective, things like justice
Sure.
or whatever. And so is out of those concerns of justice that took me to these places. I realized I cared about justice, but I actually didn't care about human beings, if that makes any sense.
Sure.
So confessionally speaking, I cared a lot about the poor abstractly, but wasn't...
Didn't have any poor friends.
Because affectionally, I just wasn't,
Right.
leaning in to those relationships. And so, but when I started going out to the prison and out into freedom, I found myself exposed to a very life-giving spirituality that I learned more by moving into those friendships than I ever brought into them. A very hope-filled, vibrant spirituality where God is very present. And so from prayer to worship to just the way they talk about the Holy Spirit, they have been my teachers and guides in recovering a very vibrant faith journey. And so I've been playing catch up a great deal with my friends in recovering a vital and deep passion of faith.
Yeah, you still teach at ACU.
Mm-hmm.
I occasionally tell people the single greatest line ever written in English was Milton's line, "Suspicion sleeps at wisdom's gate." And I want to make the case there's a difference between being suspicious and being cynical.
Mm-hmm.
And in the academy where we work, boy, cynicism is just around the corner all the time.
Right.
Because our job is to be suspicious. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we're looking for errors in students' work. How do you keep a foot in both worlds, where you have this critical eye, and at the same time you haven't become cynical about life?
Right, because I think I was getting very cynical about things. I think I keep a foot in both worlds because I actually have a foot in both worlds. I am actually out at the prison, and I am at Freedom Fellowship, and there I can be interrupted and surprised by grace or surprised by joy. And there's something about being in those locations where the gospel matters. Because I remember when I first went out to the prison, I was going to do my very first Bible study out there. And I thought, well, what should I lead with? And at the time, I was really, again, as a deconstructing kind of person, like asking critical questions, had led me to the parts of the scripture where there's lots of deconstruction. So the Lament Psalms is a place where I spent a lot of time, where there's a questioning of God, an accusation about God. And I thought, that's good stuff. And that speaks to my suspicions about things. It brings the hard questions in. And I thought, well, what better place or venue to talk about, God's absence and our accusation toward God, and where is God in the injustices of the world than out at the prison. So I thought they could really resonate with this material. And so I was going through the Lament Psalms with them, and about 30 minutes into that, they went, whoa, wait a second, like we get it, like prison is a dark place. You don't need to come in here and tell us how bad this is. What we need is a little bit of hope out here. And as a kind of a cynical, suspicious kind of Christian, I was like, I don't really do hope. Like, that's not really anything I'm particularly good at. But they needed that because of the darkness. And the same thing at Freedom. Given the lives they lead, the spirituality and the worship that they bring into it, that is a vital lifeline. And I found myself checking my cynicism because I didn't want to be deconstructing faith with people who faith is the thing that gets them out of bed in the morning.
Yeah.
And I had realized that my doubts and my cynicism was a privilege of how insulated I was from the world. I had a job. I have a retirement plan. And so I could ask hard. I could kick the props out from under my faith because I felt like I didn't need faith, to some sense. But when you're with people where the faith is vital and it is the thing that keeps them holding on, you're just a little slower to ask a deconstructing, suspicious question because you're going to the very roots. And I realized that's what they had that I didn't have. Faith for them had gone to the roots of their lives. And for me, it was a hobby, an intellectual hobby that I could kind of hold in a very analytical, surgical kind of distance that I realized that had happened in my faith journey.
That's tough.
It's tough.
Yeah. I mean, I think we come out of a culture that thinks the solution to everything is an educational issue.
Yeah.
That, you know, I call it Plato's great mistake. To know the good is to do the good, and that's not always
Right.
That's not always true. And you're talking about engaging as a way to know, rather than knowing to engaging
Right.
to know, and that's actually a pretty tough sell, I think.
Yeah, and I think when I go to churches and talk about this, and we talk about hospitality, radical hospitality, it is you have to reconfigure the furniture of your life to make those experiences possible. But it seems like to me, so many of our people in our churches are so busy; they don't have any margin. They don't have room in their life for those experiences. We would like to just kind of schedule our benevolence.
How did you do that? You're a busy guy.
I learned to say no, and I learned to shelve excellence as a goal. I think we're in a culture of success and excellence, and so I've learned that sometimes certain parts of my life just have to be good enough. I could push harder to make something better, but I realized I'm a finite person with finite resources. And to pursue excellence across all domains of my life would mean I would become exhausted and depleted. And so you have to say that's good enough. I could do that, and I'm going to have to let that go. And that is from anywhere from like my yard that is not mowed right now to a class that I could, in the back of my mind, push to the next level. But I don't, and my employer probably doesn't want me to say that. But there's compromises. We have to reconcile with our finitude, our limitations. And I think that involves a great deal of shame resiliency in our culture, because you're shamed for being less than successful or not having it done. And so I think a lot of people are shamed by the success narrative of our culture into idolatrous busyness. But until you deal with the shame resiliency, we don't have the psychological capacities to fall behind our peers. In the workplace or in our neighborhood or wherever else that kind of might be. And so I think that's the thing that I've been exploring a lot recently, is the relationship between shame and Sabbath. We don't take Sabbath because we're shamed that we're going to be falling behind.
Right.
And again, shame is an emotional thing.
Right.
It's not an intellectual thing. You just can't tell people practice Sabbath.
Right.
But if they're practicing Sabbath and all the time they're feeling anxious or worried or like a loser, then those emotions are triggering bad habits. And so you can't educate people in the Sabbath the same way you can't educate people in the hospitality, because unless you're dealing with the effective responses to our lives, those emotions tend to overwhelm.
Which you do by practice.
Which we do by practice.
Yeah.
Right.
You think the relationships are more important than the excellence in every area?
Do I think the what?
The relationships are more important than the excellence in every area?
Like the relationships I've formed?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, right. Because at the end of the day, this is where I think Ecclesiastes is real good. You can put all that time and effort into achievement, but at the end of the day, it's all going to wash away. It's all fleeting. And but there's those moments in Ecclesiastes where it says, 3 chords, are better. The relationships that we have with people, those are the things that we rest in. And I think love is the one thing that at least Scripture says is stronger than death. It is eternal and will last. And so, yes, I've found great rest in those relationships. They've been very life-giving to me. So I'm happier than I've ever been because of that.
Yeah. As we move towards conclusion, what do you know about God that you didn't know before?
What do I know about God? Okay, that's a really deep question. I don't have a canned answer for that one, Randy. The thing that I think I've learned about God is that God is with us. That God isn't that force in the world that's the fix for all of our problems. And so when I'm with my friends at the prison or at Freedom, I'm not there to bring God to them to fix some sort of poverty problem or addiction problem. I've learned that the relationship, that the abiding with each other and God being with us is where I find God the most. The theologian Samuel Wells has talked about the most important word in the Bible is with. And we like to think it's for, to do for somebody, to fix something. But God with us, the relational, resting in that community and then stepping into, to use theological language, the Trinitarian community that experience the life of God together is where I've found God the most. And so abiding in God with each other, I think, is where I've learned the most about God. And I've stopped trying to fix things. As an educated, liberal, progressive kind of person, I look at a lot of the anxiety around the world, and it seems like a lot of our anxiety is about trying to get it right, to get it fixed. And if we don't get it fixed, it's all going to, fall apart. Letting go of that anxiety and just being in love with people.